Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Anbiya'i wal Mursaleen. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. So we are starting this introduction in Usul al-Fiqh. And inshallah I will explain as we go what this book is doing and how it's working. So he says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. قال القاضي الجليل أبو الحسن علي بن عمر بن أحمد المالكي البغدادي رحمه الله: سألتموني أرشدكم الله أن أجمع لكم ما وقع إلي من الأدلة في مسائل الخلاف بين مالك بن أنس رحمه الله وبين من خالفه من فقهاء الأمصار رحمه الله رحمة الله عليهم وأن أبين ما علمته من حججي في ذلك. So this book that we're looking at is an introduction to a book on comparative fiqh. Okay, our author, he is in Baghdad. He is in this huge metropolis where there's lots of different people. There's Malikis and Hanbalis and Shafi'is and Hanafis and everybody, and people don't agree, which is fine. And so he writes this book. I have it to my left here, عيون الأدلة في مسائل الخلاف بين فقهاء الأمصار, right? And basically it's a book on comparative fiqh, okay? Where he's mentioning that here's an issue, different people say this, why are we right? Okay, why are we the Malikis right? Now, why did he write this introduction? He says, وأنا أذكر لكم جملة من ذلك بمشيئة الله وعونه لتعلموا أن مالكا رحمه الله كان موفقا في مذهبه متبعا لكتاب الله وسنة نبيه وإجماع الأمة والنظر الصحيح، وأن الله خصه بحسن الاختيار ولطيف الحكمة وجودة الاعتبار. والله تعالى يوفقني وإياكم لما يقربه إليه ويزلف لديه. Right, to prove that basically I'm going to show you that he was right in the way he looked at things. Now, when we are discussing anything, fiqh or otherwise, we always have to understand that an argument has two parts to it. Okay, it has two parts for it. It has a major and a minor premise every single time we think, right? So we're talking about politics, we're talking about fiqh, we're talking about buying a car, right? There is a philosophy, there are a set of assumptions, there is a motherboard, right, behind everything. Those who do not understand that waste their own time and waste other people's time. Those who understand that do useful things. So I've decided I'm coming up with a system for child education, okay, for child education. And I say, for example, I'm taking a certain methodology, okay? I'm going to take a certain methodology and I'm going to take the best possible methodology of education. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to find other people who already applied my methodology and see how they would plan a lesson for a fifth grade math class. Okay, so step number one, adopt methodology. Step number two, see other people who have done the same, who have applied the methodology to the same problem. Okay, step number three, apply the methodology problem. Step number four, see if I agree with them. Step number five, decide either to follow suit, I'm going to agree with their conclusion, or disagree with the conclusion, or change methodology. Okay, I'm going to repeat. I'm trying to create a lesson plan for a fifth grade math class. First question, what is your what is your goals and visions of education? If you don't know what that is and you don't have a goal, obviously it's going to be a meaningless argument. You're going to come to a conclusion that is meaningless. Okay? So I choose my research method. I choose my methodology, my philosophy of education, my whatever it is. Okay? 2, I look and see what other people did in the same thing. Okay? 3, I apply it myself. 4, I see if I agree with the conclusion. 5, think, am I going to change? Am I going to agree or disagree? Or actually, and if I'm going to disagree, am I going to disagree on the specific conclusion? Or am I going to disagree on the methodology itself? Okay? How is this relevant to fiqh? So I come along and I say, I'm going to pray like this. And you say, no, pray like that. And I say, what methodology of processing the Quran and Sunnah have you adopted? That methodology is called usul. That's called your usul. Okay? That's called your usul. You get your usul and you find a bunch of people who have applied that usul to this question. Okay? And you apply the usul to this question. And you see, did you agree or did you disagree? You agreed? Fantastic. You disagreed? You're now going to say, is there something wrong in the application on the lower level? Like how I applied it to specifics? Or is it on a higher level? Okay? Or is it on a higher level? If it's on a higher level, I say, you know what? I'm applying the wrong methodology. Okay? I'm applying the wrong methodology. Does that make sense? In which case, don't apply that methodology again. Go and find another methodology. So this is a systematic way of working that makes sense. And if you don't work in this way, it doesn't make sense. Is everyone following me?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So let's not do this. Okay, let's do the opposite. But this is correct. This isn't correct. Okay, what's your methodology? I don't have one. Okay. So if you don't know what your methodology is, or you don't know that there are different types of methodology, then you're just not going to see anything. A. B, if you don't look what other people did, okay, then you're going to have a problem. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Here is, for example, the Shafi methodology. So when you say Shafi, you're talking about two separate things. You are talking, or three separate things. You're talking about a research method, which is called usul, and you are talking about universal systems, which are called qawaid fiqhiyya, and you're talking about ahkam fiqhiyya, the rulings themselves. Most people, when they say madhab, they just think of the rules, but that's wrong. A madhab is three things: the qawaid usuliyya, your research method; al-qawaid al-kulliyya, right, how your fiqh works; and ahkam shar'iyya or ahkam fiqhiyya, the rulings themselves. This is halal, this is haram, this is sunnah. Okay, so now what happens if I'm going to get the Shafi usul or get the Hanbali usul or get whatever usul, and I'm going to apply it, but I'm not going to see what they did, I'm going to have problems, right? So what will happen normally in Western research is you will say, for example, I'm re-looking at this famous poem by Goethe, okay, re-looking at it from a different methodological point of view, right? Because I think more things can be analyzed another way and different conclusions can be drawn, right? But if you are using the same methodology, you now have to say, well, previous researchers who have applied this research have come to this conclusion. That's what you have to do. Any sane person does. Okay. So when you study a madhab, that's what we do. You say, I'm going to take certain settings for my research method. Okay. I'm going to look at masail, a question, issue that comes up, see how other people have answered it. So I'm going to learn answers, right? Learn answers, reapply it myself, and see if I agree or disagree. And then you might find that you disagree, but you don't just disagree on, your disagreement is not on the level of on the specifics. It's not on the level of, okay, I applied it and I came to these conclusions, but actually you realize you fundamentally disagree, right? So when you disagree with somebody, you're saying, I disagree on your application of these principles, or I disagree with the principles themselves. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, and I'll give you an example. The other day, I was driving past a university, okay, here in Malaysia, and it says 100% employability. 100% employability. What is their educational philosophy? Right? If they're advertising the fact that this is the best university in Malaysia because you have 100% employability, you will leave, you finish this degree, you will definitely get employed. So how do they look at education? What is the point of education for them?
Their target is to get employed at the end.
Right. So they're going to say, I memorized what's it, غاية المنتهى. Is that what it's called? By Mara Academy, is that what it's called?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, memorize the whole thing. Am I going to get employed?
No.
No. So therefore, it's a bad education.
That's the wrong method.
Exactly, right? So you're talking to this person. The person's like, you're an idiot. I'm sorry. You're like, why did you say Hanbali fiqh? You're not going to get a job, right? It's not going to get a job. Right? What's the point? And you realize your question is not, the question is not about applying a system and coming to a different conclusion. We fundamentally disagree. Okay, we fundamentally disagree. Therefore, we are wasting time talking about fiqh. We should leave the room of fiqh and go to usul al-fiqh. Okay, usul al-fiqh. So instead of saying, brother, you should move your fingers, don't move your fingers. That's not the discussion that I'm having necessarily, but rather it's a discussion of something usul. So that is why sane people, educated people, how do they study fiqh? They either study usul al-fiqh or they study al-fiqh al-madhhabi. Why? Because I'm either talking to you as a Hanbali, right? And I'm saying, Sheikh, or fellow student, you have applied the research process in the wrong way. The conclusion should be X, and you say no, it should be Y. Okay? Or we should be going to usul al-fiqh and saying, I'm fundamentally not, I disagree with you. In which case, let's go and talk about the usul. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's why the same person studies usul al-fiqh, and you can have a fight there, go and kill each other, right? Kill each other, tear each other apart in usul al-fiqh. And when you come to fiqh, you can only welcome in this room if you are also a Maliki. Otherwise, don't talk to me. Don't come and talk to me if you're not a Shafi, because here we're saying, assuming this research methods, then talk to me. So in the 20th and 21st century, we've seen we've seen a genuine waste of time and waste of energy where people debate fiqh without that in mind. And I'll give you an example. I'm just trying to make myself employable for these Hanbalis, right? I have here Dalil al-Talib. Okay, Dalil al-Talib. I have this textbook in the Hanbali school. Okay, and it says so and so so and so al-Hanbali. So Hanbali does not mean sectarian. Hanbali means I understand my research methods and I have adopted this research method, which we do whenever you do your master's or PhD, right? Whenever you write a thesis, you say, what is the research method you applied? So this book is saying this, okay? And he explains his methodology. And you look at the footnotes, which is done by a kind of semi-Salafi, right? This is here حققه وجد بواشيه Sultan Abdurrahman Al-Eid or something like that.
Yes, Sultan.
Right? So the footnotes, right, he says some crazy things sometimes. So for example, in the introduction, he says that the book that he says, I have compared this book, okay, and I made frequent use of Al-Awsat by Ibn al-Mundhir. Ibn al-Mundhir is like a book, like this book that we're reading, right? Comparative fiqh. But Ibn Mundhir is which madhab?
Shafi'i.
Shafi'i. So he's going to say, look, he agreed with us or he disagreed with us. And that is irrelevant because it has nothing to do with our discussion as a Hanbali. Whether Ibn Mundhir agrees with you or does not agree with you, that's irrelevant because Ibn Mundhir is working as a Shafi'i. He will say ashab, right? So I'll give you an example. Ibn Mundhir is discussing the issue of lamps, okay, in the Awsat. Okay, he is a Shafi'i. So Ibn Mundhir, he will disagree with the Shafi'i school on many issues, but he is useful to me as a Shafi'i because we are using the same usul, and so we're talking in the same way. Okay, we're talking in the same way. We have the same usul. And he will say things like qala ashabuna, right? Meaning the Shafi'is, right? Our fellows in this, meaning we have adopted the same usul and this. He will disagree with Imam Shafi saying, hey, your usul dictate otherwise, right? And that can, okay. So now you have somebody like, let's compare Ibn Mundhir. So now this book here, it says some strange things. I was reading the book and it says, وَقَطَعَ بِهِ الْبَغَوِي. So قَطَعَ بِهِ الْبَغَوِي. Say, I'm a Shafi. I've heard that before. قَطَعَ بِهِ الْبَغَوِي. Baghawi, he mentioned that as the only opinion in the school. Right? And I'm reading this Hanbali fiqh book and he says, قَطَعَ بِهِ الْبَغَوِي. I say, why are you telling me what Baghawi says? Why are you telling me, right, what all the ashab of the Shafi'i school said? That's not relevant to me. That's relevant to me. I'm interested in discussing with a Shafi'i when I'm discussing about usul. Because I'm going to, then when I design my research method, I will debate with a Shafi'i. Yes or no. That's another discussion. But bringing it here is a waste of time. It's a waste of time. Okay? It's methodologically useless, right? Methodologically useless. It's not interesting to me at all, right? Most of the time. Okay, so now let's compare him to someone like Imam al-Tahawi. Imam al-Tahawi, okay, he was a Shafi'i. Imam al-Tahawi had major issues with the Shafi'i school, but those issues were not actually on the issue of furu'. It was on the issue of usul, right? So many issues, he realized actually the Shafi school methodology of research is wrong. I disagree with you. I'm not following your research anymore. Excuse me. Okay? Dawood al-Zahiri, similar. Dawood al-Zahiri, Shafi'i. He reads Imam Shafi'i's essay on Ibtal Istihsan, why you can't bend rules in the Sharia, why you can't have exceptions unless there's a clear exception in Sharia. You can't do this, you can't do that. He said everything that Imam Shafi'i said applies to Qiyas. I reject Qiyas. So I reject everybody. I have my own research method, which is I don't believe in Qiyas. Okay, so there's a meaningful approach, right? You're sick and tired of students who want to get a job, right? Or they want to finish, right? They like, when I'm going to finish this, Sheikh? The student at university, Sheikh, is Doctor, is this chapter on the test, right? And the teacher's like, it's ilm, habibi. We're not here for the test, right? It's for the ilm. So he's sick and tired of it, so he stops teaching at university, teaches elsewhere. Because I don't believe in that methodology, I'm using this methodology. But if we're following the same methodology, we can now just talk about the conclusions of this methodology. And that's a useful discussion with somebody who's following the same methodology. Does that make sense? So this is called usul, which is, so he says, before I talk to you about who's right and who's wrong, I'm going to set the foreground. I'm going to put my standards in place. I'm going to say, let's assume X. Okay, so now this is the research methods. And so when he's going to prove the rest of the book, he's going to say on the basis of what I've already said in the beginning of the book. Does that make sense? And so now there's a system. As opposed to ar-rajihu kada. today people say this, the stronger position is this. Based on what research method? It's just the rajih. That doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? For many of you have spoken about martial arts before. Aikido, they say Aikido is like a lame martial art because did they ever win any MMA things? Someone who's in Aikido? Is Khabib an Aikido guy? Is whoever else, are these people, do they win anything in MMA? No. Right? They never even fight. So therefore, Aikido is not a martial art because you never even fight anybody. But it goes back to your how do you see a martial art? What is the point of a martial art? You're looking at it as, can you beat people up or can you defend yourself? He's looking at it from a totally different point of view. Right? So you need to look at the point of view first and then apply it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sure.
Right.
I have a question. I don't know if I fully understand it. So what you basically said was that fiqh is meaningless to discuss with other madhahib because we don't have the same usul, but to discuss usul al-fiqh with other madhahib, that would be logical because now we are discussing about the approach on how we got to the rules.
Exactly. Right. So it's like, again, let's imagine Farhan, where do you live?
Germany.
Germany. Okay. So Germany is very left wing compared to Europe, compared to England in general, right? So but there are certain right wing people, right? So you're gonna have different parties, and some people will say, yes, we should have immigrants. Yes, we should help the poor. Yes, we should have free healthcare. Yes, we should have free schools. And others say, no, everybody should pay for themselves, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
So
correct.
These people are having an argument. Should we or should we not accept these 10,000 refugees? So in reality, it's a useless conversation because we need to first agree on what we are. Okay? And so the discussion should be, what is the point of a German government? What are we trying to do? You agree on that, and then you say, should we accept these refugees or not? Okay, otherwise it's just pointless. And that's why democracy is usually pointless, because you're talking to me in terms of results, whereas that's not even valid. You're saying, for example, hey, you're going to have cheap labor and nice doner kebab because you're going to have a bunch of Syrian refugees coming into the country. Like, okay. Hey, you're not going to have a job because he's going to take your job. Oh, I don't like that. Whereas a real debate should be, how should a country be run? How should it work? Right? So that means everybody who is going to have a decision should study politics and philosophy and religion and ethics and come to a conclusion about this. And then we will agree on this. And then based on this, we say, given that Germany is about Germans, we should not have anybody in this country that is not ethnically German. Goodbye. Or given that Germany is not about Germans, it is a country that happens to exist in Europe, and it helps us to do this or helps to do this. What is your philosophy? Otherwise, it's a useless conversation, and most conversations are useless, right? And so something that can be said about democracy and about fiqh is the same thing. It's said, Allahu alam, right? بسند ضعيف that Winston Churchill, he said, the strongest proof against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Okay? The strongest proof against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. You have no idea what you've been talking about. So therefore, you shouldn't vote. Same thing in fiqh. What is your goal? How are you trying to function? Okay? Now, I want you to make some assumptions. Okay? Now apply that. So the Salafi, for example, Salafis are of different types, but the general Salafi, his idea is somewhere between Zahiri and Shafi'i usul. He's kind of a bit confused. So he needs to study Shafi usul and then study Shafi fiqh, see the conclusions that the Shafis came to, and then see if he agrees or disagrees, and then is a useful contribution to this discussion. It's useful. I disagree, whatever, right? Or I disagree fundamentally with the Shafi usul and I'm adopting this usul instead. In which case, okay, adopt the Hanbali school. Okay, now take the Hanbali usul. See how the Hanbalis study Hanbali fiqh, see how they applied things. See if you apply it in the same way. Okay, agree or disagree. And then you're a useful Hanbali. Right? When you disagree with the Hanbali school, it's a useful disagreement because you're working in the same work. You're one of us. Right? You're one of us, and it's a useful thing that's welcome, right? Same thing Hanbali, same thing Malik, etc. Hanafi, same thing Hanafi. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Jazakallah.
Yes.
But
Yes.
again, you are applying something. So you're applying something without the framework. So usul is the framework, the assumption, what are we trying to do, right? What are your settings? Your default settings. So the default settings, will change the things. So this is what we do in usul, and it makes sense. What's his name? Al-Qarafi, right? Al-Qarafi does exactly the same thing. He has a book on fiqh, and he says, I'm going to write an introduction to my book of fiqh, which is going to be a book on usul. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm going to do. And you will see all the conclusions that come later on, it's all based on this. As opposed to somebody who is looking for end results, right? Like, Mawlid is bad. So I'm going to prove that. Mawlid is good, so I'm going to prove that. Totally wrong, right? You do not do that. You say, whatever the conclusions are, I don't mind. I'm open, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell me, but I'm going to come up with my search process and I'm going to apply it, right? So I'll give you an example, just myself as somebody who's learning and going through this process, right? I've studied Shafi fiqh and I read Shafi fiqh and I teach Shafi fiqh, and there's always, because I'm a bit of an arrogant person, may Allah protect me, I've always had lots of things in my head, okay? Like issues where that doesn't make sense, doesn't make sense, why they say this, etc., right? And this exact breakdown is exactly how it feels in my head. Is that there are certain things that are masail juz'iyya, meaning just how you applied it. It's not a big issue, right? Where you see, for example, Ibn Mundhir says something which is different to Imam Shafi. Ibn Khuzaymah says something which is different to Imam Shafi. It's not a fundamental difference of agreement, right? The way that they're working is the same way they're working, right? And it's not a big issue, right? And there's other issues for myself as a talib ilm where I've seen actually fundamentally that is off, right? Fundamentally that is off, right? So I'll give you two examples, okay? So Imam Shafi, one of the key things that Imam Shafi does is he says there are 4 sources of law: Quran, Sahih Hadith, Qiyas, Ijma', right? These are the 4. Istihsan is not one of them. So istihsan is something that all fuqaha use in reality, including the Shafis, but the Shafis in principle don't. And this means that you can kind of bend rules a little bit. Like there's bend rules when you see where it's a small kind of problem and there's greater benefit here, or tweak this here, tweak that there, right? He doesn't do things like that. So I just give you two examples in contracts where Imam Shafi'i follows what we call the qiyas, right? The norm, as opposed to the istihsan. Okay, so Sharikat al-Abdan is a contract where two people work in tandem, they work together on related tasks. That related task creates money, and then they split the money on a certain thing. So, for example, Farhan is going to make Farhan, you are Turkish?
Yeah.
Right. So he's going to make kufte, right? What was that one with lentils? Kufte something? Uh,
Do you mean Adana
no,
or
it's kufta
kebab?
something. It's made
Chi
out of
köfte. Chi
lentils.
köfte. Chi köfte.
No, it's like ketasi or something, metasi or something. I don't know. Anyway, he's going to make kufta, okay? He's going to make kufta, and I am going to market it, and Shibrim is going to deliver it, okay? So we are gonna. So he does the work, I do the marketing, Shibrim does delivery. I get 10%, Shibrim gets 30%, and Farhan gets the 60%. Okay. Now I didn't put any money. Shibrim didn't put any money. But I had to do time and effort, marketing, etc. And so we did, that's called Sharikat al-Abdan. So in principle, you could imagine we're going to have lots of difference of agreement because it's not very clear how much work we're doing, right? And we didn't merge any money to make a sharika really. So it shouldn't really be halal. Okay, it shouldn't really be halal. However, the Jumhur, the Hanbalis, Malikis, and Hanafis, they say it's halal, but lihajat an-nas ilay, because people need to, right? So Imam Shafi comes along and says, is there a dalil in the Quran and Sunnah? Yes, there's a dalil against it. The Prophet ﷺ, Naha Rasulullah an bay al-gharar. The Prophet ﷺ forbade vague contracts. This is very vague. It's not clear exactly how much work you're going to do, there's problems, etc. The Sharia has not excluded it, so you can't come along and make an exception. Okay? So why is it that Imam Shafi doesn't accept it? Because he doesn't believe in istihsan. Why is it that everybody else accepts it? Because they believe in istihsan. Okay? They will do things like that. Imam Ahmad, lots of times, will do these kind of things, right? Malikis, tons of scenarios. Imam Malik, for example, he will say, he will agree with everybody that the qiyas is that children cannot be witnesses ever. A child cannot be a witness. But then say, yeah, Imam Malik, what about a scenario where there was just kids there were no adults, okay? And one of the boys stabs to death another kid. And then they all leave immediately and they all run to the police separately and they don't talk to anybody else. And they go immediately to the police and say, we saw so and so kill so and so. He says, yes, because it's a short time. They didn't mingle with anybody else. There was nobody else there. So, what else are we going to do? Okay, so Imam Malik accepts that. Min bab istihsan. He's like, this is an exception to the rule. Imam Shafi says, you can't do that. Another example where Imam Shafi allows something, but everyone else forbids it, which is bay al-aina. Right? Bay al-aina is I get my phone. This is a used iPhone 13. Okay, and I'm going to sell it in cash to Shibrim for 18 million euros. Okay, 18 million euros. He says, qabilt, accepted the bay'. Fine. So now he owes me 18 million euros. Then I say, now Shibrim, sell it back to me for 20 million euros to be paid in 6 months. Sorry, he pays to me in cash. Okay, he pays me in cash, and then I sell it back to him to be paid the same phone with no change whatsoever to pay more in credit. So the phone is not worth that kind of money. It is obvious that he and I are just doing a loan contract where I have borrowed 18 million euros, all right, and I'm paying him 2 million euros in interest, right? Thus, the phone was just a conduit, was just a tool that I used. The three madhahib, they say, look at the qasd, look what's happening here. The Sharia has forbidden interest. This person is just trying to find a loophole and it's haram. Imam al-Shafi says you have no right to do that. You can't come along and say it's haram when the Sharia said it's halal, because that's not your role. You can't work on behalf of Allah. So Imam Shafi says it's halal, everyone else says haram. Why? Because of istihsan. So for me, as a talib ilm, is walking inshallah ya Rab in a straight line. I come along and say, Fareed, do you agree? Do you disagree with Imam Shafi in his conclusion of applying the issue of istihsan? Or is it you disagree on an usul? Like, which side would you prefer to be in? Would you prefer to be on the Jumhur who say, listen, bro, like, obviously we know the game that you're playing and it's haram. Or would you prefer to be on the team that says, no, it doesn't matter what happens. Khalas, that's a Sharia and just leave it as it is. Choose A or B and then go in a straight line. Right? So personally speaking, number one, we do have istihsan, the Shafi school, and it is used. It does come up many times in reality, right? But it doesn't come up that much, right? And in principle, it's not that. So for me, I'm like, yeah, the Jumhur are right. Okay? So that's an usul difference of agreement, right? So that means Farid, you're actually on the other camp then, right? You're not really a Shafi then. Because you have to decide, are you in camp A or camp B? In which case, now you're going to be on camp A. That means you're probably a Hanbali, Maliki, Hanafi, and not in that camp, right? Does that make sense? And so now you have to go in a straight line. You have to go in a straight line, okay? So now you're going to hear something like Imam Malik saying something like that and say, well, so now you have to say, I agree with Imam Malik, but what are the or I agree with the concept of istihsan, but what are the criterion for it? How does it work, right? Which is a huge problem. And then you might find yourself in 20 years going back to the first camp, right? If that makes sense, right? And this is how we should interact with fiqh. Okay, you hit a brick wall, you go, that sounds really weird. Okay, I have my research settings, I'm applying it, and I'm finding a different answer to the other people who are applying it. What is wrong with my understanding? And you realize, oh, did anybody else disagree with me? What's going on? And sometimes you realize, hey, actually, there's a strong debate in the school. You find these different things, right? And you might incline to one opinion over the other, etc. Or you say, you know what? I have a fundamental problem with this. Like, there's a fundamental problem that's going on here. Like, this doesn't actually make sense, right? Like, I can't accept this. Like, the way that you're working is wrong. In which case, go into the other one. So Imam al-Tahawi, fundamental disagree, he becomes a Hanafi. Okay, now we're going to work. Now, does he agree with everything in the Hanafi school? Not necessarily, but he's now working in that process and it makes sense. As opposed to somebody says the strong position is this, the strong position is that. Number one, you haven't adopted a research method, a madhab. Number two, you have not been trained in that madhab. And therefore, you can't even apply it. So what's the point? You're not even saying anything, right? It's like saying, I identify as a Neoplatonist. Have you read Plato? No. Have you read Aristotle? No. Have you read philosophy? Yeah, I mean, I listen to some YouTube channels. Like, Habibi, you're not a Neoplatonist. What are you talking about? Right? Doesn't make any sense. Right?
Yeah.
You know, I'm a communist, really. You're okay, fantastic. Tell me about communism. Oh, I don't know anything about communism. I just hate rich people. Right? That's not a research method. That's called being stupid. Right? So usul is give me stating your so here, this is ilm. It says, I am going to debate with the rest of the world, okay? And I'm going to set my research methods, okay? So that's what he does. He says, وَقَدْ رَأَيْتُ أَنْ أُقَدِّلَ لَكُمْ مَا بَيْنَ يَدَيِ الْمَسَائِلَ جُمْلَةً مِنْ أُصُولِ التي وقفت عليها من مذهبه وما يليق به مذهبه. So now, usul al-fiqh, traditionally, meaning going back to in its early days, worked in two ways. Okay? Usul al-fiqh worked in two ways. It would either start like as he's saying, or he would work as Imam Shafi worked. So let's look at these two approaches. So we have what's called tariqat al-fuqaha and tariqat al-mutakallimin. Okay? Two different styles of doing usul al-fiqh. Style number one is called tariqat al-fuqaha. Okay? Which is, when you say the fuqaha, we mean the Hanafis. Which is, I'm going to assume that Imam Abu Hanifa and the Sahibain, Imam Muhammad and Qadi Abu Yusuf are right. Okay? So let's make them gods for us some time. Okay? Metaphor. Right? Let's assume that Imam Abu Hanifa and Qadi Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad are right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get their conclusions. I'm going to weigh it against the Quran and Sunnah and say, look how they deal with Quran and Sunnah, and then say, therefore, the interpretive method is X. So I'm going to infer interpretive methods from their conclusions. So this is what he says here. وَقَفْتُ عَلَيْهَا مِنْ مَذْهَبِهِ. Things that I already know about how he works, his research method. وَمَا يَلِيقُ بِهِ مَذْهَبُهُ. And things that would make sense. Like, given that Imam Malik does this and this and this, even if he didn't explicitly state it, we can infer that he's doing this. Like we can follow Imam Malik and look how here's a hadith, here's a verse of the Quran, here's his conclusion. This is his research method, right? So I'm going to infer. So what he's doing is I'm making Imam Malik my central point, and I'm going to infer research methods from that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And this is called طريقة الفقهاء, the way of the fuqaha, because it usually was the Hanafis, and that's how they wrote books and etc. And then they would also then, in their books on usul, also talk about qawaid fiqhiyya, because that would also make sense. Because I'm saying, you know, my teacher mentions this, and so in it, I'm going to mention systems, right? I'm going to mention systems, okay? So systems of how they process the Quran and Sunnah, and then systems of how their fiqh works. Okay? Now there's Tariqat al-Mutakallimin. Tariqat al-Mutakallimin is totally different. Tariqat al-Mutakallimin, it says, let's start on zero. Okay? Do I even exist? Okay, prove that I exist, prove that you exist, prove that if I exist and you exist, there must be a creator, So it starts from zero and it builds up to kalam. Okay, we are now on the level of kalam. Okay, so that's the starting point. We now believe in Allah, we believe in a messenger, we believe in this. Okay, fine, we are Muslims. Logically, therefore, what should be a proof? Okay, Quran, okay, Sunnah, what about this, what about that, right? What I don't do is say, look, Imam Shafi'i used a Sahih Hadith and he didn't use a weak Hadith. I'm going to say, theoretically, why would it make sense to use a Sahih Hadith and not use a weak Hadith? Okay, so let's go to, for example, the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger have enshrined the concept of courts and the concept of witnesses. So therefore, a witness is like a narrator. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger have already structured the whole idea of sanad and sahih hadith, etc. So I'm not going to say we use the sahih hadith because Imam Ahmad used to use sahih hadith, right? It is not descriptive. Sorry, it's not descriptive. It is prescriptive, meaning I'm not going to make any assumptions and I'm going to start from the basic conclusions of kalam and I'm going to build up. So now I get to the conclusion, I don't do istihsan. I'm going to come to the conclusion, I do qiyas. I come to the conclusion, and I come to the conclusion, and then I'm going to apply them to the primary text and move on from that. Right? This is called tariqat al-mutakallimin. Okay? So they're not making any assumptions. It is not madhab centric in principle. And it is just a free discussion, right? And so traditionally, the Hanafis followed tariqat al-mutakallimin, the tariqat al-fuqaha. They wrote in one way, and the Shafis, Hanbalis, and Malikis wrote in another way. Okay? And but then what happened? What happened by about the 9th century is kind of the ways the two paths merged, and so everybody just works in tariqat al-mutakallimin, meaning you can't come along and say this is right because Imam Ahmad did this, right? You should use a mursal hadith because there's a mursal hadith that Imam Abu Hanifa acted upon. You can't do that. Rather, you have to say what is the proof, right? Etc. Okay. Now let's go into some specifics, and this is very important. Okay. So طريقة المتكلمين it starts with Imam Shafi. Imam Shafi is kind of the first person who wrote on usul. But then Imam Shafi starts this whole thing called usul al-fiqh. And so here we see, a century or so later, Ibn Qassar is writing on usul al-fiqh, and his abwab are basically the same topics that Imam Shafi would talk about, etc. But what happens is you get to a stage when everybody is commenting and refining, and you get to a point where the Risala of Imam Shafi becomes passé. It becomes very old and not very useful anymore. Okay, and all these commentaries are just there, and we now move on to our next stage. Okay, and this stage is a kind of like, I would say, the teenage or the late teenage stage of usul al-fiqh, which is the 4 books, right? Which is the Mustasfa of Imam al-Ghazali, right? Which is the 5th century. end of the 5th century, coming to the 6th century. The Burhan of Imam al-Haramain. And then we have the Umda and the Mu'tamad of Al-Qadi Hussein and Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. Okay, so these are two Ash'aris and Shafi'is, and two, I believe they were Shafi'is as well, Mu'tazilis. Very important. Okay, because basically all usul of fiqh today goes back to these four books, basically. Right? So usul of fiqh is it's those discussions that they have. What you say is basically everything is there. So, for example, Hanbali usul al-fiqh. Okay? What is it called? Rawdat al-Nadir, what's it called in Hanbali fiqh? By Ibn Qudama.
Yes, yeah.
Right? That's basically the Mustasfa. It's basically the Mustasfa by Imam Ghazali. Okay? So it's very important when you're speaking to a Hanbali, to a Salafi, who's like, yeah. It's like, Imam Ghazali is a Sufi kafir Ashari. It's like, well, Habibi, your usul of fiqh, the tools that you use, allegedly, if you claim to be a Shafi or you claim to be a Hanbali or I don't know, whatever you claim to be, you're going to go back to Imam Ghazali, right? What's the book by Ibn Qayyim? Minhaj al-Qasidin, Minhaj al-Salikin, what is it called?
No, it's
منهاج القاصدين yeah.
Right, Minhaj al-Qasidin, Ihya al-Ulumuddin, that's what it is. Right, with
Ibn Qudama.
سيد غزالي.
Right? So the Ihya al-Ulumuddin defined tasawwuf for everybody, including all the Hanbalis. Right? So somebody comes along and says, yeah, Imam Ghazali, Ashari, crazy guy, Ashari Sufi, that is like, everybody is in great debt to Imam Ghazali. Like, read Imam Ghazali and you understand why. Like, oh my God, right? And so it's very important that people have to understand that. So anyway, basically what happens then is you have a whole few stages of refinement on these discussions, etc., etc., etc. But basically these are the four books that everything goes back to. Right? These are the four books that basically everything goes back to. So in terms of the organization of the discussions and the arguments of the discussions, yes, you could still go A or B, right? And obviously two of these people are Mu'tazila and they actually have usuli problems with us, right? But so we have the Mustasfa Imam Ghazali. Okay, the Mustasfa of Imam Ghazali, the Burhan of Imam al-Haramain. So these are Shafi'is, Ash'aris, right? And I believe it's the Umda, somebody can correct it. The Umda of Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar and the Mu'tamad of Al-Qadi Hussein. And these two are Mu'tazili, right? So Mu'tazili obviously going to have major issues in Kalam, okay? Some of those issues in Kalam are going to trickle in to us, right? But they're useful discussions because at least we're talking on the same level now, right? We're talking the same level, okay? And then just aside, go ahead.
Why would those two books of Mu'tazili have such a impact, provided that we have thousands of other?
Why? Because they organize the discussions and summarize the debates in the best possible way.
Okay.
Yeah. So 2 points. 2 points. Number one, we have Mu'tazila and Shia people that we rely on all the time in our usul al-fiqh, in our qira'at, in our hadith, right? So the whole idea that, anybody who's bid'ah, we don't have anything to do with it, that's a kind of, that's not an Elmi thing, right? And maybe Asadi can just double check. Maybe I missed up the Umda and the Mu'tamad. Double check. I don't think the books exist. So I mean, they're not in print. I don't think. Wallahu a'lam.
I'll check it, inshallah.
Double check, inshallah. So anyway, so general thing for Tulab Ilm. Yes, we should not surround ourselves with people like this, people of bid'ah. But people of bid'ah, we use them all the time in fiqh and aqidah, and not in aqidah, in fiqh, in usul, in nahu, and tafsir all the time, right? I think one of my favorite tafsirs, I think, is Makhshari, 100%. So, you know, that's a key thing to understand. My teacher, Sheikh Ali Hani, would frequently use Tabtabai, right? Shi'i. You know, even in some issues of kalam as well, we use Shi'i things, right? Ibn Khirash, I believe. Khirash, huge hadith critic, right? Shi'i. That's number one. Number two, the Shia and the Khawarij, in terms of physicality and physically where they were and the issues in fiqh, they're usually on another planet. We're not really talking to them. We're not really talking to them. Whereas the Mu'tazila, they were part of us. A Mu'tazila is a firqa from Ahl Sunnah, right? So they are Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah who have gone wrong. So they are our teachers, they are our colleagues, that's what's happening. You will find, Hanbali can double check Ibn Aqil, right? I think they say that Ibn Aqil of the Hanbalis, Mu'tazili. Al-Jassas, they say, is also Mu'tazili, Wallahu alam, right? You find certain issues here and there in the Shafi school as well. This person's Mu'tazili. So you have to understand that i'tizal was, these people were among us, right? The trends that are among us. It wasn't something else. It was something other. Okay? And so it's important to understand that. Yeah, because we're not talking about their conclusions. We're talking about how they organize the discussions and what they talk about. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Khair. So let's just go for another 10 minutes, inshallah. So then he's going to say, Bab al-kalam fi ikhtilaf wujuh dalail. Right? Dalail or adilla. He says, اعلم أن للعلوم طرقا منها جلي وخفي وذلك أن الله تبارك وتعالى لما أراد أن يمتحن عباده وأن يبتليهم فرق بين طرق العلم وجعل منها ظاهرا جليا وباطنا خفيا ليرفع الذين أوتوا العلم كما قال عز وجل يرفع الله الذين آمنوا منكم والذين أوتوا العلم درجات. So the first thing he's going to talk about then, he's going to mention it here. It says, والدليل على ذلك وهو أن الدلائل لو كانت كلها جلية ظاهرة لم يقع التنازع وارتفع الخلاف ولم يحتج إلى تدبر ولا اعتبار ولا تفكر ولا بطل الابتداء ولم يحصل الامتحان ولا كان للشبهة مدخل ولا وقع شك ولا حسبان ولا ظن ولا وجد جهول لأن العلم يكون طبعا وهذا فاسد فبطل أن تكون العلوم كلها جلية. Right? So this is something so he's saying basically, are things all blatantly obvious? So again, this is a mistake many Salafis, that certain Salafis will have, is like, it's so obvious there are certain Sahih hadiths and certain weak hadiths. Follow Sahih hadiths, they all mean one thing, and they can only be interpreted in one possible way, which is the way that I've understood it, and that's it. And he says, is that the case? The answer is no. Things are not clear. So the first thing he says, there are certain things that are clear and certain things that are not clear. Okay? And that's going to go back to two elements. One is naql, and the other is dalalat al-alfaz. To what extent is it clear that this was said? Right? How do I know Allah has said this, or how do I know the Prophet has said this? That's one aspect. The other aspect is, how do I know what it means? It's dalala. How strong is it? Right? He says, وَقَدْ قَالَ Allah. So he says it's not the same. There are things that are what we call dhanni al-thubut and dhanni al-dalala. It is probabilistic. It could mean more than one thing, and it could or could have not been said. Right? وَلَوْ كَانَتْ كُلُّهَا خَفِيَّةً لَمْ يُتَوَصَّلْ إِلَى مَعْرِفَةِ شَيْءٍ مِنْهَا. إذ الخفي لا يعلم بنفسه لأنه لو علم بنفسه لكان جليا وهذا فاسد أيضا ولبطل أن تكون كلها خفية. So everything is hidden. Well, we don't know anything about the Sharia, do we? The Sharia, who knows what it means? Who knows what hadiths are reliable or not? That's also not true. So rather, there are certain things that are blatantly obvious and clear, and other things that are not. And that is an essential key concept. وقد قال الله عز وجل هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات, things are not so clear. وما يذكر إلا أولو الألباب. So I missed the two. I mixed them up, I believe, right? Umda and Mu'tamid. I don't have either of those books. I don't know if they're in print. Allahu a'lam. وقال عز وجل ولو ردوه إلى الرسول وإلى الأولي الأمر منهم لعلمه الذين يستنبطونه منه. Right? So there's things that are not clear. So what did they have to do? They say bring it back to the Prophet because it's not clear. Bring it back to the people of scholarship because it's not clear and they can work it out. وإذا بطل أن يكون علم كله جليا وبطل أن يكون كله خفيا ثبت أن منه جليا ومنه خفيا وبالله التوفيق. So there are some things that are obvious and some things that are not. Okay, so then he goes into a kalam discussion. And he says, so given that things are not clear, you have to think about it, right? So he says, al-kalamu fi wujuh. So in reality, what he said before is kind of inclusive of two discussions, right? Inclusive of two discussions. One is, when we are interpreting revelation, are some things crystal clear? Yes. And are some things not crystal clear? Yeah. No. Okay, so that's an important thing. The other issue is, are we mukallafeen or are we mujbareen? Meaning, has Allah charged us with the moral responsibility of accepting Islam and accepting revelation, accepting the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ, even though it's not crystal clear? Or has he forced us to believe in it by making it so obvious that you cannot possibly not accept it? Right? So he's not very accurate in terms of what he's speaking because it's an early work, right? But in reality are two different discussions, right? One thing is there are certain issues in the deen that are not so clear, and that's fine, and that's for us to do ijtihad in and try and find out. And there are other issues that are very, very clear. And the other issue then is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made that which is clear about the religion, has made that sufficiently unclear so that you can still reject it without being insane. Right? People can still come along and say they don't believe in Islam or they don't believe in the Prophet without being actually insane, right? But because they can hide behind what's called shubuhat. It could look at this way, it could look at that way. They can hide behind fake arguments, right? But there's two different discussions. So then he's going on to discussion of which is a discussion of aqidah and a discussion of usul, which is wujub al-nazar. Do you have to start thinking about things or not? He says وجوب النظر والاستدلال هو مذهب مالك رحمه الله في سائر أهل العلم لأنه قد استدل في المسائل بالاستدلالات. Right? He didn't just say I don't know. He tried to work it out. واحتج بقياسات ومن الناس من ينفي. Right? So this is basically, do I have to start in those things that are not clear? Should I just say, hey, it's not clear, leave it alone? Or should I say it's not clear and I have to do it? So the answer is you're obliged to do that. Okay? So things that are not clear in the deen, you have to work it out. Now, again, we're going to split it into two different discussions. Kalam and fiqh. Okay? So, it is Asr time. Now it is Asr time. You have just prayed Asr in the masjid. Okay? You leave to get something from your car and you come back into the masjid in order to recite Quran from Asr to Maghrib. What should you do right now? When you go into the masjid, what should you do before you sit down?
The sunnah prayer.
You should do this
Tahiyyat
Tahiyyat al-Masjid. MashaAllah, Ariyas. Okay? Tahiyyat al-Masjid. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, إِذَا دَخَلَ أَحْدُكُمْ مَسْجِدًا فَلَا يَجْلِسَنَّ حَتَّى يَرْكَعْ فِيهِ رَكْعَتَيْنِ. Okay, the Prophet sallallahu said, when you enter the masjid, then do not sit down until you have prayed 2 rak'ahs. Okay, khair. But the Prophet ﷺ also told us something else.
One shouldn't pray nafila بعد العصر.
Aha. So we have a problem, correct? We have a problem.
Yes.
It's not zahir. You come along and say, kafir, because you didn't do tahiyyat al-masjid. Habibi, it's not very obvious. There's a conflict here. The Prophet ﷺ said, don't pray after Asr. And the Prophet ﷺ also said, when you go into a masjid, pray. So does it mean you can't pray after Asr unless you're going into a masjid? Or does it mean you can't sit down when you go into a masjid unless it's after Asr? That's not obvious. This is the point he made. Okay? So in this situation, what do I do? Okay? And now let's assume that I am Imam Ahmad, I am Imam Shafi, I am Imam so-and-so, and I have ihata bil ulum. I know all the discussions. I know what people have said and what people have not said, and I know the proofs for and against, and I know all the hadith, and I know all the issues. Should I say A, well, it's not clear, therefore I'm not going to do anything? Or should I say B, I don't know the answer, but this is more likely, and I'm going to do this? Which one should I do?
Second one.
Second one, right? So, key concept, نحن متعبدون بالظن. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us, forced us, given us no choice but to worship Him, even though we don't know what's going on. We have to find the most likely conclusion and go with that. Proof A is not strong. Proof B is not strong. But proof A is slightly stronger than proof B, so therefore I'm going to go with it. Right? That's what you have. You have no choice. You're obliged to do that. So again, the Salafi or the ignorant Salafi, he comes along and says, no, it's obvious. And then like, oh, that's because you haven't studied fiqh. When you study fiqh, you're like, yeah, I understand now. It is not obvious. Like things are not as obvious as you would imagine. Right? There are lots of problems. So the question is, A, are there things that are obvious? And then B, do you have to work them out? Yes. Okay. So because here I'd either be doing something wrong by praying after Asr or doing something wrong by sitting down. Okay. And so I have to do ijtihad. Imam Shafi says, yes, you pray. The Jumhur says, no, you don't pray. Right. And then the Jumhur are going to say, are you sinful or you're not sinful, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now let's take the same discussion in Kalam. Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. Allah's hand is over their hand. Is it 100% obvious what this means?
No.
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 Because yad, ظاهر of a yad, means the jariha, the limb, the physical limb that has a length, has a width, has a depth, and takes space and time and place, is of Allah, is over their hand. But then you say, yeah, but that would mean that Allah is inside of His creation. That would mean that Allah is like us. So there's a problem, right? There is a problem. So, هل يجب الاستدلال? Right? Do I now have to look into that? Right? So before, I was between a rock and a hard place. Before, Allah would either blame me for praying after Asr or blame me for not doing Tahiyyat al-Masjid. Right? So I was trying to run away from Allah's ghadab and trying to go to Allah's rida. Okay? I might be wrong, but I didn't have a choice. Okay? You can't just say I don't know. Okay? Here, هل يجب علي أن أعين معنى اليد? Is it obligatory for me to know what that means? Has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told, am I stuck between a rock and a hard place? Has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, you have to do A or B and I can't find out which one? Right? Imam al-Ghazali, he mentions in Qanun al-Ta'wil, he says, guys, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not asked you to tell you what that means. Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. Allah has not told you to do that. He's not told you to do that. Right? So you just do what we call tafweed muqayyad. Right? Tafweed muqayyad. There might be other terms that Hanbalis have for it. Right? Tafweed muqayyad meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laysa kamithlihi shay. Khalas, Allah is not like us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not composed of parts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't have body parts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not inside the universe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not like this, not like that, etc. What does it mean? Allahu a'lam. That's it. So, هل يجب النظر? In that scenario, no. But as a mufti, you are Imam Malik. Here's a situation that's very complex. You have to give a fatwa because, right, you either say I don't know, or you're going to come up with an answer. And if you're more than 51% confident, you're going to have to give your fatwa. That's it. You don't have a choice. So there's a big difference between furu' and usul, right? Meaning aqaid. There are certain things in aqaid you can say I don't know, and just leave it like that. Right? As long as I do nafi of a tashbih, khalas. Right? As Imam Laqani says, وَكُلُّ نَصٍ أَوْهَمَ التَّشْبِيهَ أَوِّلْهُ أَوْ فَوِّضْ وَرُمْ تَنْزِيهًا. Right? So he mentions ta'wil, which we're not talking about here, which is another. And he's saying, أَوْ فَوِّضْ وَرُمْ تَنْزِيهًا. Leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the criterion, on the caveat that it does not mean that I believe in that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a hand or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. Right? Go ahead, Muhammad.
Yeah. وجوب النظر, is it for it should be for the mujtahid?
For the mujtahid, correct. Right? But you could imagine somebody come along and saying, like, you could imagine somebody, right? You're speaking to your aunt, okay, in Tunisia. She's like, خلاص اختلف الشيوخ يا ما شاء الله خلاص ليش نتعب أنفسنا خلاص بعضهم يحكوا هيك وهيك بيحكوا هيك وأنا خلاص أنا مش ما ليش دخل. Right? So she's going to come along and she's going to say, by virtue of the fact that there's debate, I don't have to worry about it at all. No, Sitti, right? You can't. You're either going to do A or B. So you're either going to follow Sheikh so-and-so or Sheikh so-and-so. You can't just say, I don't do anything. Right? So for the mujtahid, he's going to say, I don't know the answer, لكن هذا أرجح من هذا. خلاص. Right? He's going to do that. And for the muqallid, he's not going to say, oh, خلاص. You know, you hear some people say that it's not in the Quran, just leave it alone. What they mean is, it's not crystal clear, so just ignore it. That's not true. That's not true. Yes, it is true that it's not crystal clear. No, it is not true that you could ignore it. Right? So yes, it's true for the mujtahid. He's going to do nadhar in the istidlal. They're going to say this and this and this. But for me and you, as soon as you find out that it's an mas'ala khilafiyya, you still have to choose A or B. You can't just say, oh, it doesn't matter anymore. Does that make sense? So this is very important for the awam. Because the awam, they'll do this.
This is for the fiqh, right?
There was a some guy in Egypt. He was like, all the madhahib are wrong because they all use weak proofs. That is true. We all use weak proofs. That is true. But is it acceptable for me to follow a weaker proof when I have a weak proof? Right? Would it be acceptable, for example, my son is lost somewhere on this mountain. I have no idea where it is. And he could possibly be on the right side and he could possibly left side. I have no idea. But it's 51% chance he's on the left and 51% chance on the not 49 on the left. Where should I go as a father? يجب علي, right? And التجه نحو الأرجح. Like I have to go in the direction of the most likely thing. Oh, how could I possibly go in the less likely place? I am a surgeon doing surgery on your father. And you said, doctor, why did my dad die? He said, well, there was two options. I went on the less likely one. Why did you do that? Why did you choose the least likely one? Oh, because I didn't know. So the answer is, نحن متعبدون بالظن. The doctor, the parent, the educator, the mujtahid, the politician, they're going to say, I don't know how to deal with the situation, but this looks better than this. Even though it's not even though it is not zahir, I still have to act, right? So I still have to act with dhann, right? So what he's saying is yajibu al-amal bil-dhann. That's what it means. That's what it means. Like I have to act upon something when it is marginally more likely. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Muhammad, makes sense?
Sheikh, this is regarding the fiqh masail, not the aqidah, right?
That is correct. So with the for the Asha'ira, they're going to say you can do ta'wil, but it's not yajib, right? You're not obliged to do that, right? So they will say, you know, yes, there are some issues in aqidah that could be understood in two different ways. No, you're not obliged to look into it. Whereas in fiqh, somebody has to. If it applies to you, you have to. And if it doesn't apply to you, it's still fard kifaya. Right? Somebody still has to solve this problem. Right? The man said, by Allah, I will use a miswak today. And so he got his own finger that was cut off. So do we say it's not a siwak because it's not your finger, because it was his finger? And then if we say his finger does count when it's cut off, is it still considered your finger? Yes or no? This has to be answered. You can't say I don't know. Right? So again, for the ignorant Salafi, and again, there are not so ignorant Salafi, the ignorant Salafi, it's things like this, like, oh, look at these madhab people, they use weak proofs. If you don't have anything else if you don't have a strong proof, you're going to use a weak proof. You have to use something, right? If something is marginally more likely, you have to act upon it, right? So Ibn Hazm, what does Ibn Hazm do? And this is people, Ibn Hazm's books have been printed, in the last century, etc. And it's affected certain kind of Salafi ways of thinking. Ibn Hazm, he tries to avoid nazar. He says basically there's no such thing as qiyas, so that you're not doing something that you're not sure about, and a sahih hadith yufid al-ilm. Right? When you have a sahih hadith, it's a fact, and a weak hadith is wrong. So it's very simple. Sahih hadith, fact. Weak hadith, false. Very easy. So it's a very simple approach, and it feels good. You feel like you're in this realm of knowledge. You're not in reality, right? Anybody who knows anything about hadith, no, that's not the case at all. Right? A sahih hadith, لا يفيد لا أنا أجزم بأن الحديث الصحيح لا يفيد الجزم. Right? It's like 100% a sahih hadith does not tell you that it does not. You're still not sure, right? And so the language is not clear, and the thubut is not clear, and that's the nature of what we have to deal with. We are working with a misty picture. We can't see the picture properly, and there's no way around it. And he says, وَالدَّلِيلُ عَلَى وُجُوبِهِ أَنَّهُ إِذَا ثَبَتَ أَنَّ فِي الدَّلَائِلِ جَلِيًّا وخفيا فلا بد من النظر لأن في تركه امتناع عن الوصول إلى معرفة خفي منها وذلك غير جائز فدل على وجوبه. وقد دل الله على وجوب النظر والاستدلال والتفكر والاعتبار في آية كثيرة في كتابه فقال عز وجل أفلا ينظرون إلى الإبل كيف خلقت وقال عز وجل أفلا يرون أن نأتي الأرض ننقصها من أطرافها قال تبارك وتعالى أفلم يسيروا في الأرض فينظروا كيف كان عاقبة الذين من قبلهم وقال عز وجل إنما أعظكم بواحد أن تقوموا لله مثنى وثلاثة ثم تتفكروا ما بصاحبكم من جنة إن هو إلا نذير مبين. So in reality, these are all aqisa qat'iyya. These are reflections that lead to pictures that are very clear, right? It's not exactly what we're talking about, right? And there are many other examples though. So then he's going to go on. So he says, Bab al-kalam fi ibtal al-taqleed min al-alim lil-alim. And so in the waraqat, this is going to come at the end, right? It comes at the end, right? Sifat al-mustafti wal-mufti wal-mustafti. Here he's bringing it right in the beginning and talks about some interesting furu' in the Shafi and the Maliki school about it, right? So doing taqleed. What does taqleed mean? Taqleed means deferring judgment, right? Deferring judgment. That's the best translation I think there is in English for it. I like that word. To defer judgment, right? So Azhar, he says, okay, we're now visiting South India, and we defer judgment to Azhar. Where should we go and eat? Which restaurant should we go in? I don't know. He knows. So I'm going to defer a judgment, right? Then I ask, hey, I say, Azhar, I have 3 kids. How should I educate them? He's like, I don't know. So then I say, no, you tell me how I should educate my kids. So I defer judgment to Azhar on how I should educate my kids. And I say, my son just spilt some milk. Azhar, what should I do? So now how I raise my children, whether I should buy an iPhone or whatever. That's called deferring judgment, right? So that's taqleed, deferring judgment. Should you do that or should you not do that? And who is allowed to defer their judgment to whom? Right? We'll talk about it, inshallah, next week. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.